Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil A. Colonna, and this is Nashville. Welcome to today's show. Today we're going to talk about professional licenses, or the licenses that workers in certain professions need in order to simply do their jobs. Right now in the U.S., about 1 in 5 workers need a license to work. Here in Tennessee, licensed professions include doctors, nurses, lawyers, accountants, architects, engineers, auctioneers, contractors, home inspectors, funeral directors, embalmers, cosmetologists, barbers, geologists, insurers, realtors, soil scientists, and private investigators, and there are plenty more as well. Now, each of these professions has a professional licensure board that sets the standards for what it takes to get a license and interpret laws, rules, and regulations. These boards also handle disciplinary issues and have the power to remove a license when necessary. Rules, regulations, and procedural issues for specific professions might seem easy to ignore, but they're incredibly important. Licensing boards and the decisions they make can have a big impact on the care and services we receive, as well as the career paths we can work towards here in our state. Here to help us understand more about professional licensing boards is Professor Rebecca Allensworth. Professor Allensworth is currently the Associate Dean for Research at the David Daniels Allen Professor of Law at the Vanderbilt Law School. She's also a national expert on professional licensing boards. She's testified before Congress about this, and her research has been cited in Supreme Court cases. We'd like to welcome her to This Is Nashville. Rebecca, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate it. Okay, so we have a lot to kind of get into, but you are a national expert on professional licensing boards.
That's right.
How's it feel?
Oh, it feels great.
A lot of research you've done into this.
A ton of research, a ton of different kinds of research, too.
Okay, so like these boards and the rules and regulations they set, they're not really well studied or well known by the public, but they have a really significant impact on our economy. How did you really first get interested in studying this topic, and what kept you hooked on it?
Well, my first year as a professor at Vanderbilt, a mentor of mine said, it always bothered me that the professions get kind of a free pass when it comes to antitrust. We know those boards are all basically cartels, and they make these anti-competitive regulations, and somebody should write a law review article. Maybe you and I should write a law review article together. So we did that, and while we were writing that article, it turns out the FTC was pursuing a case arguing just that boards are cartels unless states actively supervise them. And then that case went all the way to the Supreme Court. So that's how my research ended up cited by the Supreme Court. And then I would say the thing that got me hooked was I needed tenure. So I had to write another couple articles, maybe stick with the one that got me cited by the Supreme Court, stick with that topic. Mm-hmm. So I wrote a couple more articles. And by then I got tenure and I had 3 articles on the subject. Maybe it's time to write a book. So that's how I got interested in this next phase of my research.
All right. So what does it mean for a profession to be a licensed profession? What does that look like?
So it means that the state has said you cannot do this thing unless you have our permission. And it takes some major investment in human capital, I call it. So education, testing, to get that permission. So I would say that tends to be, at least months, often years of education. And then the state says you can do this, but only because we say you can do it.
Okay. So how does a profession become a licensed profession? Through the state?
Exactly, through the legislature. So the legislature has to make a law. These are called practice acts. And it says, the practice of blah-blah-blah shall require a license. And usually these practice acts that are created as a matter of state law also create a licensing board. And it'll say in the statute, the board will be comprised of this kind of members, and it will do the regulatory work.
So I understand, I read off at the top of the show a long list of just some of the professions that require licenses here in the state. But why do some require licenses and some don't? I'm thinking I can understand why a private investigator would need a license, or a doctor or an attorney even to have a license to practice law. But what about someone like a chef? They're involved with people every day and actually putting their hands on the food that people are consuming.
It's a great question. So anytime you ask a profession, why does your profession need to be licensed? They'll often say that it's, dangerous if you don't do it right. But as you point out, there's a lot of things that people do that are dangerous if you don't do it right. Chefs are a great example. Daycare worker is another one. Now, chefs and daycare workers are subject to regulation. There's rules about how you handle food, and there's rules about, how a baby goes to sleep on their back. But we don't do that through professional licensure. And the answer to your question of why, it's partly historical. Part of it has to do with who's organizing themselves and advocating for the licensing law. Usually that's the profession itself. And then there's some economics behind it. So childcare is already really expensive. Restaurant food is pretty expensive. Are we all ready to just add a 10% or higher tax on those things? Maybe the legislature's not going to go for that. But if our therapists come along and say, we want licensure, the legislature maybe doesn't think it's that big of a deal.
Okay. So in theory, what's the role of a professional licensing board?
So in theory, a board interprets the statute and decides which applicants are going to be granted licenses. So, have you satisfied the requirements to enter the profession? On some level, decides what those requirements are on the margins. Some of the requirements are set by the legislature. And then they decide who's acting badly, who needs to have their license restricted, and who should have it taken away.
All right. So in reality, what do those boards do for us, the public?
Well, in my book, I argue not enough.
Okay.
Certainly some of what boards do, and it depends on the profession. I mean, one of the crazy things about your list is that, you started with doctors and you ended with, I can't remember the last one, but I know auctioneers was on there.
Yes.
They are all using the exact same form of regulation. It's kind of a one-size-fits-all solution to the problem. And that, I think, is sort of crazy. And it's hard to say one thing about what all these boards do because they're all really different and they end up doing very different things. But the theory, anyway, is that they protect us from practitioners who don't know what they're doing and practitioners who are being unethical. And I think sometimes they do that.
Sometimes they do that.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to get into the times that they don't and some of the problems that come with that. But you mentioned these boards. Who are the people who serve on these boards? Well,
this is the central point of my book and of my findings. The boards are required in almost every case to be staffed by a majority of members of the profession. And by that, I mean currently working, busy, active professionals within the profession. They have to take time off from their busy work to go, actually the medical board is like 2 blocks from here. They have to come to Nashville for a couple days a year and read all these cases and digest all this regulatory work that they do. And then they go back to their busy professional lives. They're not expert regulators, and they are from their profession and have that kind of ethos ingrained.
What are some of the potential dangers of that?
Well, the interests of the profession and the interests of the public are not always the same. Professional licensing laws and the boards are supposed to be looking out for the public. And there's some examples you could give where the profession and the public are interested in the same thing. So professions really like to have licensure. It cuts down on competition. It adds to the prestige of a profession, and licensure can benefit the public. The problem is when it goes too far, it's still good for the profession, but it may not be good for the public.
You mentioned that the boards are made up mostly of working professionals in said profession. Or do they have a public person, like someone to represent the public on these boards normally?
Yeah. So I actually found by statute, I found all 1,740 licensing boards in the U.S. This was a previous project that I worked on. And we looked at the membership of them, and 85% are a majority of professionals. But almost all of them have at least 1 or 2 or 3 seats that go to what we call public members, which is just to say people who are not members of the profession.
Okay. What do they add to the board?
Well, again, the answer in some cases might be not much. So it really depends on the public member. There's not any standards really for who you put as a public member. And by you, I mean the governor. Usually it's the governor who decides who sits on these boards. There's not a lot of standards for who you pick for this board. And so you might pick somebody who, you owe a favor to or a friend of yours. And you might not pick somebody who ends up being interested in or knowledgeable about the public needs.
Okay. Now, here in Tennessee, licensing boards operate within the Tennessee Department of Health and the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance. So what are the board's relationships with the state departments, particularly when it comes to funding, bureaucratic support, and investigations?
Yeah. Well, I could nerd out on this question for the whole rest of the hour.
Oh, wow.
But
Okay.
I would have to become my antitrust professor self, and that may not be quite what you're looking for. The relationship is that the boards are kind of overseen by the Department of Health and the Department of Commerce and Insurance. And they are housed there. That's where they have their meetings. Their staff are employed by that. So the lawyers, the executive directors are all full-time employees of the state. But the state, in that sense, bureaucrats, don't make the decisions. So they don't have the power to overturn a licensing disciplinary decision, for example. So that's the relationship. It's like one of support, but not one of decision making. And the funds mostly come through the fees for the licenses themselves.
Okay. Now, what do you think these boards do well? You said not much, but what do they do well?
Gosh, that's a kind of a stumper question. I think that I guess I'm tipping my hand a little bit. I think we need licensure for some professions. So I think, for example, I sat through a board hearing for discipline for an accountant. And, for all I know, that accountant really needed to lose his license, and it really did take 8 hours to get to the bottom of his case. And so I know that there's probably some cases that boards decide correctly. And I also know that boards really do seem to care about getting it right and getting the law right. But my observations were that they were often very biased.
That's something interesting. Biased in what way?
Biased in favor of the profession.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because they're active members of the profession. But would you say that they would potentially have understandings about the nuances of what it takes in the profession to potentially justify someone's maybe questionable methods?
Yeah. And then, this is a good answer to your earlier question of what do the boards do well. It is true that the boards know their profession really well. They know it better than the lawyers and the executive directors sitting there, the staff. And they understand how doctors and nurses and cosmetologists actually work and how the market actually works. And I do think that expertise is valuable. The problem is that expertise is so dominant that it kind of takes over for other considerations. I don't think you'd have to have it set up that way where you could still use the expertise, but it wouldn't have to be the majority of the board.
All right. So what do they need to improve? What are they not doing well?
Well, discipline is a good example. I think that members of the profession have a hard time being clear-eyed about the more problematic members of their profession. They also don't really act in ways that you would recognize as regulatory. So, for example, they kind of mix up the goals of the professional association and the public protection goal. They also don't understand the larger impact of the decisions that they make in the way that like a real regulator might.
So regulations, ideally, they're helped to keep the public safe. Their intent is to increase and expand public safety, but sometimes regulations can create barriers. You ask politicians during any election season. There's plenty who want to get rid of regulations for particular industries. When it comes to licensing boards, who benefits and who misses out or potentially loses something from these regulations within the boards? So
first, the one potential winner is the consumer and the patient. I think it is obviously true that some licensing boards are doing things that protect patients and consumers. Now, if they go too far, the patients and consumers can also be the losers. So if we have too much regulation, for example, if we don't let nurse practitioners practice to the full scope of their training, now we're going to have a shortage of medical provision. The consumers lose out there too, especially the rural members of our state. And then workers have a winner-loser story too. So if you're managed to get into the profession, which usually means that you have the ability to take a year or more off from the labor market, you can pay for school, you can pass a test, then you win out because you get a license, and that will make you make more money. But then there's this whole host of people, maybe especially formerly incarcerated people, who can't get a license. And they're the ones who lose out.
You know, I'm interested, like, whether or not these boards are compelled to inform the public about what's going on. What information do these boards provide to the public about the members within a specific profession?
So I think this probably differs by state and differs by board. The licensing boards are nominally a part of the state and therefore subject to sunshine laws. And so their meetings are open. You can attend. That's how I attended. I recommend all you guys go sit in on some licensing board meetings. And their records are also public, so you can ask for public records. But they don't do, I wouldn't say, a lot of sort of proactive education of the public.
Is there any regulation or oversight for how these boards operate?
Again, this is different in every state, but not enough, in my opinion, and definitely not enough in Tennessee. So as I said, the state itself doesn't have much power to tell the boards what to do. And the public and the media, if you will, like, aren't really sitting in on this and paying attention to it either. And so they're very ultimately unaccountable.
So what do you want us, members of the public, what do you want us to keep in mind when it comes to working on and being treated by a licensed professional?
I want you to understand that the disciplinary process is really flawed. And if you thought that this doctor, this nurse has a license and therefore they have not been found to, engage in sometimes very egregious misconduct, then you might be wrong. You should do your own research. And the licensing board is not always going to take an appropriate action in a disciplinary case that you might think.
Okay, Professor Rebecca Allensworth is the Associate Dean for Research and the David Daniels Allen Professor of Law at Vanderbilt Law School. Her book, The Licensing Racket, is now available. We're going to continue to talk with her later in the show, so we'll see you soon, Rebecca.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Now, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll find out what it's like to serve on a professional licensing board here in Tennessee with 3 board members. Stay with us. This is Nashville.
Funding for This Is Nashville comes from Burr and Foreman Law Firm, serving clients with transactional, litigation, and regulatory needs. Discovering how each client defines a win and working with them every step of the way to achieve it. Burr.com. Funding for This Is Nashville comes from you, our listeners, and Music City Prep Clinic, Nashville-based provider for PrEP and offering comprehensive sexual health services in an environment designed to be safe, professional, and shame-free. Learn more at musiccityprep.org.
I'm Khalil Colonna, and this is Nashville. Today, we are talking about professional licensing boards. Here in Tennessee, professionals including doctors, lawyers, contractors, private investigators, cosmetologists, and accountants all must meet licensing requirements and are subject to discipline from licensing boards. And if there's a complaint filed against them. Pardon me for that word salad right there. All right, so we're going to talk to 3 people who have experience serving on licensing boards. They are Dr. Stephen Lloyd. He's in his 6th year serving on the Tennessee Medical Examiners Board, the board that oversees medical doctors in our state. Dr. Lloyd is currently the board's president. We also have Tamika Turner and Perry Baldwin, both who serve on the Tennessee Board of Cosmetology and Barber Examiners. Tamika Turner runs a cosmetology school and has developed training programs in high school as well as a prison in Memphis. And Perry Baldwin is a chemical engineer who serves as the public member of the board. Tamika and Perry, welcome to This Is Nashville. Stephen, welcome back. It's good to have you all here.
Welcome. Thank you.
All right, so I want to start off with you, Tamika. I understand that you've been interested in doing hair since you were very, very young, and you've had a varied experience in the cosmetology field. Talk to me about that, how you first got into the field.
Yes. Well, thank you for having me. As a little girl, I did my friend's hair in summer camp and at home. I did. And so as I grew older, I never wanted to make this a profession. However, after I graduated from high school, the plans that I had in my mind totally changed. And so I wanted to become a professional. I went to school. I completed all my hours. I started working before I actually took my exam. And so when I talk to my students, I tell my students all the time, I've been on every side of this industry, so there's nothing that you can get past me. So I've worked with and without a license. And so just over the years, all of the knowledge and all of the information that I have obtained, it's been very beneficial, not only to me and for my students as well.
Okay, thank you so much. We're working on getting your audio clear, but thank you for that, Tamika. Now, Perry, you're the public member of the Cosmetology and Barber Examiners Board. You don't work in the field, but tell me this, how and why did you get interested on serving the board? Do you hang out at barbershops all the time?
Well, I tell you what, that's a funny thing. I tried it one time, and I don't have that craft.
Okay.
So a lot of my friends that do own barbershops here and that are beauticians and things like that, they have a lot of complaints about things that they see out here. So I thought it'd be real interesting to go ahead and get on this board and try to make some changes.
All right. Now, Stephen, you serve on the Tennessee Medical Examiners Board. Tell us this for listeners who didn't get to hear your story a couple years ago when you were first on the show. Tell us how you got interested in medicine originally.
Always interested in medicine since I was a little boy. I grew up in Northeast Tennessee, a little town called Jonesboro. And, I liked science. And the reality is that, I didn't come from a family that placed an emphasis on education. Nobody had ever graduated college in my family. And so they were mechanics. And there's nothing against mechanics, but I couldn't be a mechanic. I've got two left hands and kind of like Perry there, just wasn't equipped to do that. And really, was trying to earn some respect. Believe it or not, I know that sounds like a horrible reason to become a doctor, but it was my motivation early on. It's certainly not now, but was back then.
So what does it mean to you to serve on the board that you do right now?
Well, it's really important for me. And by the way, I love Rebecca, and I think she'll tell you that I know her pretty well and really like what she's done with her book. And I think it's very fair. But, for me, our mission is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens of the state of Tennessee. And I take that, very, very seriously. And, Rebecca was having a hard time finding out what boards do well. And that kind of hurt my feelings a little bit because I know how hard I work at it and obviously have shortcomings and things that we need to improve on. But I'm not a member of the Tennessee Medical Association. I never have been. So I don't come that route. I came because the governor appointed me. And really, more than likely, it was because of my expertise in prescribing, which is what I do in the outside world.
Well, thank you for that. Perry, what does it mean for you to be a part of the Cosmetology and Barber Examiners Board?
Well, like he said, it kind of, made me feel like, hey, me as a public member, I'm here to help be an advocate for the people out here in the public. And there's a lot of things that I hear that I don't agree with some of the members, but we all can just discuss it and talk about it, and things do change. And so, I think it's a wonderful thing to have somebody from the public on the board.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, Tamika, I understand we got you on a different line. Tell me this. You said that when you teach your students, you tell them you've been on both sides of the cosmetology industry. You've been licensed and unlicensed. But after time of serving on this board, what insights did you learn about the industry that you didn't previous to your appointment? Tamika, you with us?
Yes, I'm with you. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Tell me.
So,
yeah, continue. I'm sorry.
No, so before the appointment, I did have a license and I worked in the industry as an educator and as an advocate for the beauty industry. Because when I opened my natural hair school, the Institute of Beauty, we were the first natural hair school open in Tennessee, and we were faced with regulations. people thinking that it wasn't necessary to have natural hair care. So after we were able to prevail against that bill and we just kept working, and I became a board member, things that I thought that I would do different if I were on the board. Once I became a board member, I said, okay, well, this is why these decisions were made. So, because sometimes we will like try to over-penalize someone just from, your point of view. When you look at the rubrics of not trying to penalize someone, but to make sure that they're knowledgeable and educated about how to perform a service or how to protect the public, and not only the public, but yourself as well as a professional. So I get a different point of view once I, became a board member.
Okay.
I understood that it wasn't just to penalize, but to help, keep the standards of the industry together.
All right. So, after the application and interview process, all of you are appointed by Governor Lee to the positions that you hold now. And you're all still working full time. You come to Nashville for board meetings. Last week, the Tennessee Board of Cosmetology and Barber Examiners held one of their regular meetings that Tamika and Perry attended. We have a clip of the board addressing some regular business. You will hear from Executive Director Roxana Gumoko. She followed by board members voting on a motion to approve applicants with a previous felony history to take licensing tests. Let's listen.
Our next item would be our felony applicants. You have before you applications for Andrea Caldwell, Floyd Howard, Preston Moore, Emma Najafadabi, and Christopher Shelton. These applicants have felony convictions within the last 3 years and or are currently incarcerated. The request is for them to be able to take the Tennessee examinations and be approved for licensure. The board has always approved these with 2-year agreed orders that legal prepares. Once we have those signed, we can proceed. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer or change the timeline for those agreed orders. Mr. Moore has already been approved for licensure. I believe about a year and a half ago, the board gave Joe and I the permission to move forward with anyone that was not incarcerated and needed to start working so that we could review the records and then present them for you to read on the record, but he has already been approved. Thank you.
I make a motion that these application requests be approved.
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second to approve these applicants. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. That was a motion by David McElreath and a second by Lane Petty. Thank you, members. We're going to proceed to the requests for miscellaneous items.
Okay, now, from what I gather, Tamika and Perry, that was about people looking to start a new career path, to get a second chance. 2 questions for you. One, how often are you all confronted with that type of decision? And also, what's going through your mind as you're presented with these folks who may have had a little bit of a checkered past when it comes to involvement with the law, but who've gotten themselves together and now are looking for licensure in a profession so they can start to be, contributing members of society? Perry?
Well, my first thought was, hey, we don't need those. But then thinking about it, where would they go? How would they get a job? So if that's a way of helping them give back to the society, I became all for it. And just listening to everybody and Roxanne telling us and giving us insight on these people and what they did, and it makes it a lot better. I'm sorry I'm going through it, but it makes it a lot better for those individuals.
Mm-hmm. I understand that. A question for you, Stephen. What are some of the most common types of businesses that the board you serve on? What do you guys deal with the most? What comes up the most often?
Well, I mean, there's really 3 big things. One is the initial licensure. So somebody has not met a qualification of sorts. that we have to sort through. Another is reentry. I've been out of practice for a while, and maybe surrendered their license just because they thought they were going to retire or weren't going to practice medicine anymore. Now they want to come back. And then, third is, of course, the disciplinary issues. And really, there are two big categories of those. I mean, there's a lot of different things, obviously, but one is prescribing. Right, controlled substances, and then other is boundary issues. So those are the main things that we deal with, although there's, a lot of different examples of other things we do as well.
How do you approach disciplinary action? I imagine it's of prime importance in the medical field.
Well, it's how I met Rebecca Allensworth, as a matter of fact, and she recounts it in her book, which I do recommend, by the way. And I thought it was very fair, but it is tough, and I had to learn some things about myself there. You know a little bit about my history because of me being on this program before, and for the audience who doesn't remember, I had an issue with addiction as a young doctor, and I got addicted to OxyContin and Xanax, and as a result of that, I got world-class treatment, and it not only changed my profession and life, it changed the person I am. And so there's a bit of me that has a bias towards that. I think Rebecca is exactly right. And for me, it is, not everybody has that. Not everybody went the path that I did. And so I think for me, it's been hard at times to separate out those individuals that came before us for discipline who had the same past as I did, because I looked at it as, hey, just like the previous gentleman said, right, you've got to have a way to make a living. And back in the day, I did the things that I needed to, and I continue to do those today. But I think that there is some implicit bias there. And I know for sure it hurt me early on.
One thing that I find interesting in this entire conversation is that the understanding that these boards are made up of actual living and breathing humans. They're not robots. It's not AI, not automatons to make these decisions, because Stephen, I understand that you had a pretty wild first day of serving on the medical examiner's board. And you're laughing.
Well, I was watching the time. I was hoping it was going to expire, but no, it's like the previous gentleman said, and he looks at this and says, well, these are the kind of people we don't need. But then when they get in front of you, it's different, right? Now you see somebody who has a family or who has a son or a daughter or somebody they need to support, and how do they make that living? And I think that's a different ballgame. It's one thing looking at it on a piece of paper. It's another thing when it's a living, breathing individual sitting right in front of you. And so I did have an interesting day on the first day of the board, and it's why Rebecca and I got to be friends. And if I had to endure that to be friends with Rebecca, then I'm glad it happened, because I've learned a lot from her, and I continue to learn. But yeah, I had an interesting time. We had a bad actor in front of us. I didn't realize, really, I understood the logistics or the overall idea of our role to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens of the state of Tennessee. But I didn't realize what I had at my disposal. And I also didn't realize some of the background that wasn't presented to us. And I'm not making an excuse. I made the decision I made. I was put on the board for a reason, and I'll own that. But it's a decision that I can guarantee you I've lost many nights sleep over. And matter of fact, reading Rebecca's book when I got to that section was very, very difficult for me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing that. I want to ask this, Tamika, do you think that you all on the board, do you have enough tools for fines, suspensions, and to adequately address disciplinary issues with a person who's who's a member of that profession?
Yes, I do. Not only do we have, the portal where someone could go in and file a complaint. We go through that process, and then when the inspector goes out, and he makes his does his inspection, and he sends the information back. The attorney looks over it, and then he comes to us, and so the process. Everything doesn't make it, through to us, because some things are just require a letter of warning or something like that.
Okay.
So I think that we do have, in a letter of education as well. So I think that we do have enough layers and enough help to actually.
So you're saying you do feel like you guys have enough help and enough information to make these very, very important calls. Okay, I only have a couple minutes left. I do want to ask you all this. First, I'm going to go with you, Perry, because you're the public member of this licensing board. What do you want members of the public to know about professional licensing boards and how they operate? Should they be skeptical? Should they be open? What do you think?
really they should be open, because I was really closed-minded. I didn't know what to expect, and I thought they were just making decisions, you know, listening to my friends, but being there, actually listening and witnessing and looking over the paperwork, I think it's worth having.
Stephen, are there any changes you'd like to see in how particularly maybe your board or boards in general operate? Would, having a dedicated staff, more members, a larger budget, would any of those things help?
Larger budget, no. Dedicated staff, we have it, and I love our staff. I am in awe of them on a daily basis, and as the president, I interact with them more than anybody because I'm there more than just the meetings. And so I think there's a lot of things in Rebecca's book that we need to take a good hard look at, in all honesty. And I think that when you have somebody that's looked at it to the degree Rebecca's looked at it, and has her expertise, you need to read it. And be honest with yourself. And that's hard, right? I mean, because it's an indictment of me and my actions. And one of the things Rebecca said that I think, and I'll carry it a step further, education of the public, I don't think we do a good job with that. And I think we need to improve that. And I would also talk about educating our licensees. They don't understand some of the things that they've signed up for. And you say, well, it's kind of like the, rules of the road. You're supposed to know to stop at a red light, and most people do. But there's some rules of the road that all of us, don't know. And it is incumbent on us, because we have a driver's license, to know them. But I think whenever you're talking about dealing with the professionals that I'm talking about dealing with, that we need to do a better job of educating them on the requirements of some of the things that are included in their licensure. And I think Rebecca is dead right about those things.
All right. I want to thank you all so much. Tamika, I would come to you, but they're telling me that we cannot get a clear line with you. Thank you so much for taking time and to be with us. Tamika Turner is a cosmetology school owner, and Perry Baldwin is a chemical engineer. They both serve on the Tennessee Board of Cosmetology and Barber Examiners. And Dr. Stephen Lloyd is a practicing physician here in our state and currently the president of the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners. Thanks to you all for being on with us. Really appreciate it, y'all. Okay,
Thank you.
We're going to take one last break. When we return, we'll continue our conversation about professional licensing boards by focusing on what we as consumers need to know when working with a licensed professional and how we can add to board meetings. Stick with us. This is Nashville. I'm Khalil Ekolona, and this is Nashville. Welcome back. Today we are talking about professional licensing boards. These are the boards that regulate professionals like realtors, doctors, nurses, lawyers, and contractors, just to name a few. Now, joining us again is Rebecca Hall Allensworth. She's a professor at Vanderbilt Law School who has extensively studied professional licensing boards. Rebecca, again, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate it. Okay, so you've been studying these boards for a while. You've done a deep dive on the topic, and you think that the system could be better, as you've intimated early on the show. So, okay, what professions do you think are best suited to have a professional licensing board? And give me some who aren't.
Well, I think we talked earlier about how you can use other forms of regulation to protect restaurant chefs, or to protect restaurant goers, I guess, from dangerous contamination, and how you can protect kids at daycares. So, the things that I think don't need professional licensing doesn't mean I don't think they should be regulated. Mm-hmm. But what you need to put in the professional licensing bucket are the things that are really safety sensitive, that are complex, have a lot of esoteric knowledge that you can't just distill down into a code. Babies go to sleep on their backs. Babies sit in high chairs when they get fed. These are not rules that you can write about medicine. This is how you diagnose cancer. This is how you write a will, if we're thinking about the profession of law. So yeah, medicine, law, professions for which there's a lot of professional judgment required.
Mm-hmm. So in your book, you offer a few recommendations for how boards could work better. They include more funding for staff and to conduct investigations, for board membership to include more stakeholders, and different procedures for decision making, particularly when it comes to discipline hearings. Boards are underfunded. Talk to me about that. What kind of money do they need?
So, and by the way, when you asked me earlier, what do boards get right? I should have said Steve Lloyd.
Okay.
So, he says that he doesn't need more funding. I don't know about that. Steve and I will disagree on a lot, as much as I respect him. I think that there's not enough investigation into bad conduct. And whenever I ask people about whether or not, you could do more investigation, medical boards across the country investigate about 2%, or they take action on about 2% of complaints.
Wow. That's not a high number.
It's not a high number. 98%. I mean, we're going to say that there's going to be some patients who are complaining about silly things, but 98% of them, I don't know. Who took the trouble, by the way, to go and file that complaint. Most people don't even know how to do that. So when I ask about kind of following up on more of those, people say they don't have the funds to do it. Everything's very reactionary. You take the complaints as they are. So I do think there needs to be more funding for boards. But overall, I think there should be fewer boards and there should be less regulation. The other half of my argument is let's save this very expensive, very invasive regulation only for some of the professions, like I was identifying before. So that's one change that I would make. I would also change who's on these boards. One thing Steve said is he said, I've never been a member of the medical association here in the state, and I have this perspective that's, I think, much more valuable than just the professional perspective. But that's not the average board member. And also having the professional perspective and having that kind of experience in your association, it doesn't make you evil. It doesn't make you bad. It's just a particular perspective. And so I think we need to have more seats at the table for people who have an interest in the profession but aren't in the profession. So, maybe people in adjacent professions or patient advocates. Somebody would have a different perspective from the profession itself.
So a lot more stakeholders essentially coming from the public, more people like Perry.
That's right.
On the boards.
Yeah.
How does that help us?
Because that's who these boards are meant to protect. Really, they're meant to protect the public. And, you're not going to get there with a whole board made up of the public because what do they know about medicine, right? So you need to have this balance between the expertise in the profession and then the interests of the people who the regulation's actually designed to protect.
Would some argue that having more stakeholders on the boards rather than the actual professionals kind of dilutes the authoritative position of the board?
Oh, let's hope. You mean the authoritative position of the professionals on the board? Yeah. I mean, the board would still legally have the same authority it does now. Or you could do it a different way. You could take away some of that authority. You could make these boards advisory to a member of government who has the kind of bureaucratic perspective, the disinterested perspective, and the expertise in regulation to make the decision, use the board maybe as a source of the expertise within the profession. So in any case, the idea is to dilute, as a good word you're using, the self-interest of the profession from the people who make the decision.
Okay, you leaned into a little bit of where I wanted to go next in talking about some of the collegial procedures for making a decision to actually refer and ask for more bureaucrats. And this is, look, I've rarely heard of people asking for more bureaucrats to join something or an organization. But in this case, I guess it could work. You also talk about, the public being informed a lot better. Now, you mentioned earlier that all of these boards operate under sunshine laws. Can you just describe in detail what that sunshine law is and what happens there?
So it just means that the conduct of the board is public and has to be open to the public. So you can literally go and watch their meetings. And actually in Tennessee, they're live streamed, which is really good for my research. And the records that they make are also public. And so you can go. And in fact, recently they've added a public comment section to some of the board meetings where you can get on the list and get up and say something that you'd like to say about whether you feel like this profession is being regulated in your interests. So I would definitely encourage people to do that.
So all of that is public except for discipline hearings. They're held privately.
Disciplinary hearings are also public in every profession in Tennessee except law. So law, my own profession, really kind of has it locked down. I think the public nature of disciplinary hearings is complicated, whether that actually benefits the public or not. I think if you ask Steve Lloyd that, he would say no. The fact that he was not able to sort of talk behind the scenes with his colleagues about what to do about a particularly difficult case that he alluded to made it actually harder for them to make an appropriate decision. I'm open to that. I don't always think more sunshine is always a good thing. The real problem is just that there are, as I said, 1,800 boards.
Mm-hmm.
No one's going to these meetings. No journalists. No one has time.
Mm-hmm. So I want to drill into the disciplinary process a little bit, because that's important. Because if a disciplinary process does not go well, consumers, the public, stakeholders are potentially affected negatively from this. What if 1,700 and each board can discipline according to their own whims? What would you recommend? Should there be some sort of state or federal regulation on how boards approach discipline? Or is disciplining a doctor for an infraction much different than disciplining a private investigator?
So I don't think that we need like nationalized standards for discipline. I think one thing that we need that Steve did not have that first day is really strong board education, board member education about what their job is, what the goals of their job is, what their statutes say, what their rules say, what they can and can't do. And also educate them on problems that come up in disciplinary cases like the opioid crisis or what some people call boundary issues. I would call sex abuse of patients. You know, more sort of systemic, holistic perspectives on the worst parts of your profession. The upstanding, you know, high integrity professional who's sitting on the board, and they really all were that, doesn't know anything about how people run pill mills in Tennessee. So education, I think, is really important. I worry about nationalizing things because I fear that it would be kind of a ratchet to the top. So if we just said we're going to do this at the federal level, I worry that it would be the most onerous state would be what prevails at the federal level. And as I said before, too much regulation is bad for consumers. And then I worry that in the disciplinary thing, it would be too light.
So you're definitely arguing that our boards and this structure of having these professional licensing boards needs reform. What are good examples of reform out there, either nationally or across the globe?
Yeah, so I studied England, the UK, I believe they prefer to be known as. And there they have one kind of larger regulator for the medical profession. It is not dominated by doctors. There's a lot of doctors involved in it. They use a lot of expertise. But the rulemaking side of things is bifurcated from the disciplinary side of things. And the disciplinary side of things has a lot more standards, rules, education of board members. Board members are paid and develop some expertise in having these trials. And I just think I not only think it works better, but we were actually able to show empirically that doctors that were found to have sexually abused patients and overprescribed got harsher punishments in the UK than in the US.
What would it take to implement some of these reforms?
A lot of money, which is one of the reasons why it's going to be very difficult to do. So one thing you could do to get some economies of scale, I mean, that's what the UK has that we don't have, is the economies of scale. So if you want to make this more bureaucratic, you want to give more process and more sunshine, it's going to be more expensive. I have two ways you can think about it as not being that expensive. One, you can merge some of the boards together into like a health professions board, get some economies of scale that way. And two, if you're thinking about how this is expensive, you're not thinking about the ways in which bad licensing has cost this state dearly. Bad licensing policy, no discipline essentially for overprescribers, fueled this opioid crisis that we have that we're now spending billions as a state to try to combat. Same thing with access to care issues and the cost of health care. So it's kind of penny wise and pound foolish the way it is now.
Have you spoken to state lawmakers to see about their openness to any of these incentives to move towards change and improvements?
I have not recently, and this could be a little advertising for that conversation. I would love to hear from lawmakers and policy people if they're interested in moving forward with these ideas. They will be confronted with resistance from the professions themselves.
I'm pretty sure we're going to have some people listening who may take an interest in these policy reforms that you're suggesting. So what can we as the people, the public, what can we do to make a difference?
Well, you can talk about this issue to your legislator. So I did interview some legislators early on in the book project, and what they said was, I'm just not that interested in this issue. It doesn't seem to be important to my constituents. I would argue that this is the most important labor regulatory institution we have in America. It covers 1 in 5 workers. It's making healthcare more expensive. And in some cases, it's keeping people out of professions. It matters. Tell your legislator that it matters. And then you can help work on legal, legislative attempts at reform.
If someone were interested in being the public member of a board, what do you recommend for them to do? What steps should they take?
Well, that's a good question, how you would get the attention of the governor, or rather the governor's people who make these appointments. But that would be another way to get involved. And I think it is hard for them to find people to serve on these boards because, as we said, you don't get paid. And can be a lot of work. I think that, Dr. Lloyd could certainly attest to that. And I think really anyone serving on a board could attest to that. So there should be a way to get in touch with your governor's office to say you'd be willing to be a public member of the board.
I got about 20 seconds left. What do you want to leave the people with?
Well, it's just been a thrill to talk about my research here. I hope that everybody learned a little something about licensing. It's not quite as boring as it seems. So anyway, thanks for having me.
It's definitely necessary. Thank you for being with us. Professor Rebecca Hall Allensworth is the Associate Dean for Research and the David Daniels Allen Professor of Law at Vanderbilt Law School. Her book, The Licensing Racket, is now available, and you can catch her on a recent Freakonomics episode. Professor Allensworth, Rebecca, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right. And thanks to you for tuning in this hour. This is Nashville is a production of Nashville Public Radio. Today's episode was produced and directed by Katherine Ceicys. Our technical director and board operators, Liv Lombardi. The masterminds behind our theme music are Larange and Namir Blade. You can listen back at thisisnashville.org or wherever you get good podcasts. And our conversation doesn't end here. It never ends here. You can call and comment and tell us what you want to hear from the show by leaving us a message. 615-751-2500. Hit us up on the socials, Blue Sky, Instagram, and X at This Is Nashville. This is Nashville. I'm Khalil Ekalona. We'll see you tomorrow, everybody, and be good to each other.